and also apologize for our late start, but I trust that they must have enjoyed this very interesting debate about Kuwait. Dr. Mahmoud, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening if somebody's connecting from that far. And it's a great pleasure to join this important event and to moderate a very promising panel, given the speakers we have and the topics that they are discussing. Many thanks to you, Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi, and the whole team from the ERF, and indeed the excellent work that you are leading in coordination with the GCC Economic Research Initiative, with its emphasis on great work on analysis and policy work. So today, as reflected in the agenda of the program, we have a speaker with a presentation, a fellow African, a fellow colleague from the IMF, Dr. Daniel Kanda. I hope he is with us. I didn't check on him early in Washington. And he will be presenting work with colleagues that they conducted and they published earlier, a few months ago, in October. And the work that covers the economic prospects and policy challenges for the GCC, which was published back in October, get updated through this presentation, had seen some interesting development since the sharing that piece of work, including some positive developments for the GCC countries on matters related to the price of oil. At the time of publication of the study, it was around $36 per barrel at the end of October 2020. Now it is rallying recently between $65 and $70 a barrel. But meanwhile, there have been as well very important developments on the political front with the Ula Summit. And then there have been some major reforms undertaken by different members of the GCC that would be highlighted perhaps during the presentation. And then I'll come back to you by introducing our five panelists who will be tackling the issues raised in the presentation with emphasis on policy implications when their time comes. So without further ado, I think Dr. Badawi will still finish at 4 p.m. Is that the intention, Cairo time? So we have like 90 minutes for this session?
No, you can have more time because you started late. So
okay, so let's see how it will be. So let's start then with Dr. Kanda then. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm not totally familiar with how to do PowerPoint on Zoom, so I hope my screen sharing efforts are successful. If so, please let me know, or if there is any feedback on that, I would appreciate it. Okay, thank you, Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi and Dr. Mohieldin for the invitation and your initial comments. As Dr. Mohieldin said, this is, I'm going to be giving a summary of a paper that was prepared late last year. Some of the charts for this presentation have been updated in light of the more recent information, and I'll make references to that as I go up through the presentation. First, I'll give a brief outline, and then of what comes next, and then we go from there.
We still see the presentation fine, but it's not in a full view. If you can make it in a full view, that would be great. If not, we can live with it. Yeah, we can still see it. We don't like to complicate it for you.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that, and also Let's see. Let me see if I can. Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah. So this presentation would look, we have a background first where I will go through relatively quickly in light of the fact that many others have talked about COVID and its impacts and so on. And then spend some time talking about short-term policy priorities for the GCC area. And then the last part of the presentation will focus on the key medium-term challenges facing the region, including on fiscal consolidation, broadly speaking, what the fiscal sustainability gaps look like for the region, the areas of focus for consolidation efforts, and also the key need to raise non-oil private sector-led growth and to diversify these economies away from the dependence on oil over the medium and long run, and what that means for the business environment as well as for the labor market. Now, when it comes to COVID, I'm sure I saw from the previous presentations that there has been already a lot of talk about it. I will try to be brief here. The COVID hit everybody right around about the same time, with a massive increase in infections and fears of contagion leading to lockdowns, social distancing, and everything that needed to be done to contain the spread of the disease. The left chart shows the new case 7-day moving average for the region. As you can see, there was an initial peak that came up somewhere around the middle of 2020. And then as containment measures intensified, the rates of infection fell, but they have not been quite fully controlled even since. And we now see, unfortunately, that as of the early part of this year, rates of infection have increased again. And a few countries stand out, such as UAE, in terms of the spike in new cases. So the COVID has been with us for quite some time, but it remains a significant threat, even though new vaccines have come online, and there is hope that this might finally get under control. But certainly, there is still significant uncertainty related to that. Nevertheless, the GCC countries, broadly speaking, looking at the right chart, and the GCC is in the green, they have been among the most stringent regions in the world in terms of lockdown measures and so on, which have helped them to essentially curb the rate of infection from not being too bad. But at the same time, as with other countries in the world, over time, the stringency of the measures have come down somewhat gradually, and that also might be a reason why infection rates are now beginning to pick up again. And so, continued vigilance is going to be necessary for us to get to a point where the threat is completely over with. We all know that variants are spreading and that vaccinations are there, but are proceeding very slowly. So the jury is still a little bit out as far as when we can reasonably say that the COVID is done. Now, so at the same time that countries are locking down in the region, and economic activity, especially related to those that have intensive human contact, are shutting down. And so you see tourism, retail sectors, and so on, really shutting down very rapidly, hotels and such and such. This also, because of its global ramifications, had such very substantial effects on global activity and therefore on oil demand. And so you see this chart pretty much tracks the evolution of the oil price till very recently. And you see from about March 6th, especially after the OPEC Plus talks failed, a sharp decline in oil prices to lows somewhere near $20, with one remarkable case where the WTI goes into negative territory. But then, since then, there has been a broad sort of upward trend, and especially most pronounced since the vaccine announced, the Pfizer vaccine was announced to be available. And so we see now hopeful signs that oil prices are in much more comfortable territory. But of course, the original threat from COVID is not yet gone. And so there are still significant uncertainties around the outlook, even for oil. But certainly things are looking up relative to even a few months ago. So we have essentially a COVID shock. And then we have, on top of that, especially for the region, oil price declines throughout, sharp oil price declines in 2020 especially, which meant that issues arose with growth, with the fiscal balance, and also with the external balance. Now, the countries in question in the GCC, however, and in fact globally, most countries did very similar things in terms of the response to the pandemic. You saw many fiscal stimulus packages where there was higher spending on healthcare, relaxation of tax obligations, especially to corporates, and increased spending on social safety nets to support higher unemployment in several cases. On top of that, there were monetary and financial measures, macro financial measures that were introduced. The Federal Reserve cut rates sharply, policy rates sharply, and since GCC countries are mostly pretty much all pegged in some form to the dollar, they also reduced their policy rates accordingly. There were relaxations of macroprudential rules on capital and liquidity and so on to support the financial sector. There was also guidance encouraging deferment of loan payments, which was actually quite popular in the region. And all these things, there were also cases of support, direct support to small and medium-term enterprises. So all these supports were appropriate for the time, given the depth of the downturn and the impact of these two shocks on activity. But you would also notice that if you look at the left chart, the GCC is in the middle there, which is pretty much on the left, the smallest bar, which is because in the GCC, on the fiscal front, there wasn't as much stimulus as a share of GDP compared to other countries. And the reason was, among other things, because GCC nationals are heavily employed in the public sector, job loss for them was not as severe. GCC countries already had very high expenditures relative to fiscal expenditures relative to GDP, so there was sort of less room to do more. The deterioration in their fiscal balances as the COVID shocks affected oil revenues also constrained their ability to sharply increase spending. And indeed, some of the countries, including, for example, Oman, and even Saudi had taken significant fiscal adjustment measures even in 2020. For Oman, there were broad-based cuts in expenditure. For Saudi, there was a sharp increase in the VAT rate and so on and so forth. So overall, for the GCC, fiscal stimulus was not the primary way in which they dealt with it, but much more on the monetary and financial side. Now, despite significant support to the economies in the region, we still saw very, very, very marked reductions in activity. The data we have on non-oil real GDP growth is available through Q3 2020 for most countries. And we see, as one might have expected, given the timing of COVID and the oil shocks, we see very sharp contractions in non-oil growth, particularly in the second quarter of 2020. There is some recovery in several countries in the third quarter. We don't have all the countries yet although for Oman, it continued to dip even in the third quarter. So all these countries were hard hit. The data supports the scale of the contraction, and as a result, for the overall for 2020, we are expecting very significant contraction in overall GDP, both oil and non-oil, in 2020, but are looking forward to a rebound, a significant rebound in 2021. Now, as I had alluded to before, with this, as I had alluded to before, we saw very, very marked deteriorations in the fiscal balances in several countries. You look at the chart, and in practically every country, the fiscal balance in 2020 is much, much worse than that in 2019, for example. Now, because of how the deterioration took place, and because of the recent evolution of oil prices, for the most part, you realize that 2021, in most cases, looks better because oil prices are significantly higher than they were. And several of the countries have also embarked on fiscal adjustment that in structural terms is significant enough to ensure that the overall fiscal balance in headline terms looks much better. Nevertheless, it is still the case that GCC countries have been undergoing most, not all, most of them have been having significant fiscal deficit for quite some time, ever since oil prices dropped around 2014 thereabouts. And so the COVID shocks actually simply aggravated the problem. And so there is still a large overhang of sovereign debt maturing in the coming years, which needs to be financed and also presents a challenge for several countries. And I would say, I think about 100 billion of debt is expected to be maturing between 2021 and 2025 in the GCC, which is substantial. And although several countries have ample buffers, this is not the case for all countries. Bahrain and Oman particularly do not have buffers of the scale that the other GCC countries have. And so we clearly get to the conclusion that fiscal consolidation needs to be part of the story at some point, or rather continued fiscal consolidation needs to be part of the story. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, moving forward to what all this means for the immediate, the short run. Let's taking 2021, this year, as perhaps the short run. The pandemic is not over. The issues related to lockdowns and so on are not over. In fact, in some cases, we are already hearing reports of renewed lockdown intensification in some countries in the region and so on. So, the policies, the supportive policies stance has to continue at least in 2020 until we get 2021, until we get to a point where we feel that the recovery is firmly established. So the health measures that were, expanded spending on health, including on vaccinations, should surely continue. Fiscal and monetary policy should remain accommodative. But given what we now know, given higher information, we would expect that some stronger targeting of the measures should also begin to take place. In the beginning, when the shocks hit, the measures were very broad-based, but now we know more, and therefore we can be more precise about targeting. It's not all sectors were equally affected by the shocks. So some IT-based sectors actually did just fine, and they don't need to be given this kind of support. And even within sectors, some companies might have, essentially folded up, or it may be possible to judge their viability now and, target support to those that actually have a future rather than give it to companies that may have sort of lost all hope of functioning even post-COVID. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to fine-tune the support. But nevertheless, the overall point is that there's a need to continue to be supportive in these economies until such time that we are past the danger zone. And so in the fiscal realm, support for social safety nets, small and medium enterprises, the affected sectors, and also unemployed expatriates who cannot leave the countries for whatever reason should also be supported during this period. On the monetary policy side, liquidity provision and relaxed conditions should remain, but at the same time, more thought should be given to how to withdraw the support as the crisis abates, in order that we do not jeopardize financial sector stability unduly. Likewise, on the financial sector front, when we talk about the deferred loan payments that were common, are still common in the area, in the region, at some point they have to be withdrawn, but this should be done gradually as the economy strengthens. There is also a coordination issue because there was fiscal support and there was also monetary and financial support. If you withdraw all three at the same time, you may overdo it on the withdrawal side and jeopardize the recovery as well. And therefore, timing is going to be important. In a few of the countries, the fiscal support measures mostly ended at the end of 2020, which puts a premium on being careful in terms of the timing of withdrawing the monetary and financial support measures. And then once the COVID is done or past us, the policies should strike a balance between achieving fiscal sustainability and supporting economic growth. Now, on the fiscal sustainability front, pretty much all the GCC countries, when you assess their long-run fiscal sustainability gaps, you come to the conclusion that these are sizable. And the full paper gives detailed calculations by country. But suffice to say that the main reasons why this is happening is because, first of all, the non-oil structural primary balance as of 2020 is in very large deficit. We see from the right chart that it's around 44%, a deficit of 44% non-oil structural primary balance, whereas the long-run sustainable level would be somewhere near -10. And the reason why this is happening the reason why this is a concern is because the outlook for oil demand in coming decades is not brilliant. Because of global warming and the like, it is expected that in coming decades, oil demand will peak and then begin to fall, which will also have the implication that the oil revenue to GDP ratios for pretty much all these countries over the long run will drop steadily towards essentially zero. And so with that, there's a need to adjust in order to, first of all, build up buffers and surpluses to provide for the time where the oil revenue is no longer a significant share of GDP, and to provide for those through essentially investment returns on the assets that are built up, such that there would not be a need for dramatic adjustments of the fiscal when we get into those situations, which would have attendant consequences for living standards. And so there's a substantial agenda ahead on this front. Now, when we look at the detailed fiscal positions in these countries, some areas stand out as the areas where they need significant work on in the adjustment area. First of all, public wage bills are relatively large, which in many cases is a result of the tendency also for citizens in the GCC to prefer and actively seek public sector jobs because they have higher pay and higher benefits and higher security than private sector jobs, which also highlights the challenge it will be to contain public wage bills going forward. Now, another area where there has already been some improvement, but it should continue, is on the targeting of energy subsidies. Several countries have made progress, but there are a few that clearly still maintain very large subsidies, and there is scope to trim them to better target them towards those who are actually need them. And also, most GCC countries already have very good infrastructure, and yet at the same time still continue to have substantial capital expenditures on their budgets. So there is room to consider measures that would improve the efficiency of capital spending. And also, it will be good, given global warming and the greening of the world that must come in order to save this planet. It will be good also for the authorities in the region to begin to focus more on greening their investment projects going forward. On the revenue side, there is substantial scope to increase non-oil revenues. Already there's the GCC agreement on excises on tobacco and sugary drinks, which not all have, and on VAT, not all countries have implemented these things. So that is the first round of measures that could be taken across the board. In the case of Saudi, we've seen a substantial increase in the VAT rate to levels that are actually now comparable to other Middle Eastern countries and other countries in the region. And so there is scope for other countries to follow suit as well on the VAT. Property taxation could be another way forward. Property taxes are usually, not known. They are known to be not very distortionary, and they could be set at the thresholds could be set high enough to target the more wealthy class people. Corporate taxation could also be strengthened, and personal income taxation is another area where, as of right now, there isn't any personal income taxation as such in the region. So this is an area for future action. And on top of all this, tax administration could be strengthened to support the revenue mobilization methods. Now, so it's obviously there's a tremendous amount of work to be done in these areas. Several countries have already spelled out medium-term adjustment plans and which go towards this, which is encouraging, but not all. And therefore, for those who are yet to do so, it will be good to plan these out, announce them in a transparent fashion, also to build confidence that these fiscal pressures will be addressed appropriately in the coming years. Now, the other aspect of that has to be talked about is essentially the urgent need to intensify the growth of the non-oil private sector, to intensify and to diversify the economies in the GCC, so that the very substantial reliance on oil tapers off in the coming years, given the outlook for oil. Now, the GCC in general has a young population and also rising labor force participation, but even among women. And so there's this huge number of young nationals that is expected to hit the labor force in the over even the medium term. Depending on the participation rate assumption, you could have as much as an additional 2.5 million GCC nationals entering the labor force by 2025. So this is a huge opportunity if you can utilize them efficiently, but at the same time, if not, this will pressure the fiscal tremendously, since there really is no scope to absorb them in the public sector. So there is a fiscal imperative as well as a growth imperative and even a social imperative to go on to do the reforms that are necessary to absorb these new entrants profitably into these economies. And there are, several things would have to be done to support this. There's education and training to provide the right skill sets. There's the removal of impediments to female labor participation as well, to harness the creativity and productivity of the female population. Adjustment of incentives on unemployment assistance to make it conditional on job seeking and job search and training to essentially encourage people to seek jobs in the private sector. A clearer vision on what expatriates the role of expatriates in the economy. I mean, by some calculations, about 2/3 of all workers in the region are expatriates. And the question that has to be asked is, is the current policy framework making the best use of these expatriates? Because there are several restrictions that may actually restrict the ability of expatriates to contribute to these economies. So how do you balance essentially the political pressure for nationals to take over increasing parts of the economy with how also you would get expatriates to make appropriate contributions to these economies over the long run? This will require careful consideration and careful adoption of measures over the medium and long run. And now the final area that we want to touch on is on the business environment and on small and medium enterprises. Basically, if you want to grow an economy and if you want the private sector to grow, there are many things you must do. Not only that, if you can identify, say, 10 restrictions to the proper functioning of an economy, and you even solve 9 of them and leave even just one undone, it does not really follow that you would see an improvement in overall economic efficiency. You have to solve all. And therefore, a broad-based approach is necessary. And we know that there are some basic truths that apply across the board. Wherever you have seen broad-based growth take place, some of the factors that are responsible would include a predictable, simple legal framework, robust institutions, a favorable business climate for both domestic and foreign investment, appropriate incentives, low corruption, and strong education. So these are areas that should be looked at. And, to some extent, there's always going to be a bit of a trial and error type of thing. Not all restrictions are visible at once, but as you go along, if you are paying attention and if you are, and the data are coming forth and allowing you to make decisions, you can adjust strategies so you get to the higher growth path that is desired. And finally, on small and medium-term enterprises, small and medium enterprises, they are going to be the engine of growth. Obviously, this is where typically new ideas and would be generated and cultivated and grow. And so SME growth is critical. There are a few credit guarantee schemes in the area. One of the key issues facing SMEs, and as you see on the right chart, is that even their contribution to GDP is far higher than their share of total loans. So there is a restrictiveness of access to finance that could be needs to be dealt with. And I think I've probably run over my time, so let me just wrap up quickly.
That would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so just to summarize, there is a lot that that has happened. There's a double whammy from COVID and oil market. The authorities have moved swiftly to contain the spread of the virus. The short-term priority is to maintain the support measures while improving the targeting of the support. And the withdrawal will need to be carefully calibrated as the economy is re-established. Medium and long-run fiscal consolidation will be needed to address the sizable sustainability gaps, and structural reforms to boost non-oil growth and employment will be crucial going forward. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kanda. Appreciate if you can stop sharing your screen. Well, this was quite a tour on the macroeconomic developments and the response to what you call the double whammy in the COVID-19 shock and the oil prices major decline. I think issues related to the response and the recovery been very much centered on issues related to diversification and the efforts to do a better job in getting the structural reforms and diversifying the revenue base as well. So this is not new. The calls for diversifying the structure of the economies and GCC countries is not new. In what way we can consider or should we consider that this time is going to be different and we're going to be seeing major changes? Perhaps the incentives could be coming from the major changes that we're seeing, not just in the ups and downs of the price of oil that could really follow a particular cycle or a particular pattern, but this is more of a trend. And we can see really two schools here. They are all, both schools are agreeing on some point of a peak of demand for oil. May have seen some of the recent research basically telling us that we already reached that turning point or the peak point back in 2019 with major changes in relying on renewables when there is more reliance on different and alternative means and technologies away from dependence on the hydrocarbon sector. The other view saying, well, the peak is happening or about to happen, but there is still a breathing space. You may have seen that book by Daniel Yergin, The New Map, which is basically telling us that the demand for oil and natural gas is going to be with us for quite some time, but it's not going to be forever. And but again, he's talking about something that we can really consider to factor in from now within the forthcoming 10 to 15 years. Lots of stories there, but the good thing that we are seeing from the authorities and the policymakers in the GCC and the leadership, that there is some serious attention being given to the matter, that the calls of diversification have been intensified. And while the adjustments in the oil prices could really help in some of the major reforms, but many of the countries in the GCC will not see their budgets balanced at such relatively low prices from their respective 65 and 70. Many countries still need more than that in order to have adjusting their balance sheets, especially with the spending that happened in dealing with the COVID crisis. You shared with us, Dr. Kanda, the improved short-term outlook. And so last year it was less negative than projected, and this year is better than projected. But it's all about what you mentioned at the very beginning, the effort and the capacity to deal with the COVID crisis and putting it fully under control. And it's great to hear from you that the GCC countries had managed to do well relatively in matters related to social distancing and the great effort in rolling out the vaccine. Some of the countries in the GCC are at the top of the list on that. So without further ado, I'd like to take really the time to thank you again, but definitely to introduce very quickly our distinguished panelists. We have with us today Dr. Khalid Abdullah, the General Manager of Bahrain's Scan Bank. Dr. Abdullah Taqi holds a PhD in economics from Exeter University. We have as well with us Dr. Hatem Al-Shanfari, who is a faculty member the Department of Economics and Finance at Sultan Qaboos University, and he previously worked as a member of the Board of Governors of the Central Bank of Oman. Of course, we have with us Dr. Raed Safadi, the Chief Economic Advisor for Dubai's Department of Economic Development, and he has worked previously for the OECD, World Bank, and ESQA. And Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan Al-Sheikh, the Managing Director of Hassan bin Al-Sheikh Industries, and is involved in several government and private entities. And Dr. Sheikh holds a PhD in economics from Coventry University, the UK. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Majid Al-Munayf, the Chairman of the International Advisory Committee of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. He is also the Secretary General of the Supreme Committee on Hydrocarbon Affairs of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So let me start, and I hope all of the panelists are with us on the call. I see their faces on the screen. So let's start perhaps with Dr. Khalid Abdullah. Perhaps based on this presentation and definitely with your own involvement, if you can identify the challenges facing the GCC countries beyond the COVID-19 aspect that we discussed through the presentation of Dr. Kanda, and how the fiscal deficit and the fiscal challenges could be dealt with in the GCC countries. So let's start with this point. Dr. Khalid.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Mohieldin. Thank you, Dr. Kanda, for a very comprehensive paper. I find myself in sync with the policy recommendations. So in this intervention and within the time permitted, I tried just to extrapolate further in the future. I will not focus on the temporary aspect of COVID, but focus on something that is, I think, is of more permanent nature, which Dr. Mohieldin just touched upon, and that is the future of oil prices. Today, I am old enough to be weary of any projections about oil prices in the future, but I think we have some structural changes on the ground in terms of the trends and the policies, particularly pertaining to checking the climate change and sharp rise in the contribution of renewables in the energy balance, global energy balance, which makes it, which adds even further challenges to GCC countries being primarily an oil exporter, and oil export revenues still constitute a large the majority of government revenue and very high percentage of the GDP. I think the trade-off between fiscal balance and growth is an acute one. And I think it's much more acute than easily said. And I think the GCC countries where government expenditure is the prime mover of the tempo of economic activity today is capped with the fiscal balance, which makes it quite challenging and doesn't allow much buffer for the government to maneuver growth. And this is particular for the countries who have reached acute levels of public debts, and the deficit is quite significant. But in doing so, I think it's kind of a vicious circle that needs to be broken. And today we need to focus how to turn the GCC into a net FDI inflow. For a long period of time, we've been the FDI supporter of the rest of the world, but I think now this is one way to further growth to supplement government expenditure. But also we need to address structural issues that GCC countries suffer from, and that is particularly that has to do with the significant leakages from the economy, presenting itself mainly in the high import component of the economy, but also the high leakage because of the remittance. Until recently, we've been seeing the ultimate result of government expenditure programs in Kerala and Manila due to the remittances, but addressing labor market issues is quite an urgency. We are talking about quite a fragmented and you have multi-dimensional labor market. You have formal, informal, government, private, expat, nationals within expats. Also, you have various elements. So I think addressing the leakages is important so that we address the multiplier issue. Because due to these leakages, the multiplier in GCC countries is quite low, and we are not reaping the full extent of such government expenditure programs. Previously, we afford to do that because of the continuous inflow of large oil rents, but today I think we are not in a position to compromise on that. And hence the urgency of labor market reforms and enhancing the employability of the national population is very important. And this goes beyond just technical and education. It has to address the cultural side and the work ethics. During the previous phase, we adopted very liberal policies when it comes to expat influx of expatriate labor, and that was fueled by the aggressive expenditure, particularly infrastructure expenditure, which is highly labor intensive. But I think this also needs to be checked. And while we see anti-dumping policies tackling import of needles, we don't see such policies that has to do with the most important asset, which is the human capital. Recently, some countries were prompt to address such issue. Saudi Arabia was pretty aggressive. Oman, Kuwait, it was more of a reaction rather than, until now, at least a sustainable policy. Other countries, they are yet to address this issue. Otherwise, as I said, we will not reap the benefit from the impact of government expenditure, especially during this time whereby we cannot afford any inefficiencies. I think some countries were more aggressive in addressing the fiscal balance and had stringent policies, like Bahrain. And if we look at the fiscal break-even oil price, it has decreased from almost 120 to somewhere to 83 for Bahrain, and it has reduced for Saudi Arabia and UAE. Unfortunately, it increased for Oman and Kuwait, Qatar remaining almost the same. So this gives an indication of having policies in place. Of course, again, this is taking against a background of a parental state, extending all kind of social safety nets to its population. But I think we need to inject a more smart approach whereby we have direct targeting of the needy rather than subsidizing the consumption of foodstuff for the 5-star and 7-star hotels. I'll be just quick. I think, yes, we need to increase the non-oil revenue to fuel the government expenditure. And you've spoken about the tax regimes. I think the sequence that you've talked about is the logical sequence in terms of VAT, then corporate, and then finally income tax. But I think we need also to pay attention to increase the taxable income, whether it is corporate or individual. But also, going forward with that also comes with its political economy implication. In the previous presentation, there was touched on the new social charter. Some countries have formulated their model. The Kuwaiti model goes back to the 60s, but it comes with a lot of deficiencies as we see it on the ground. Bahrain also formulated its model in 2000 through the National Charter, but it definitely going forward, it would request for a more meaningful, I would say, participation in the decision making and setting accountabilities. I think a lot of the countries have tackled the rent-seeking activities, which is important also to facilitate FDI, and we see a lot of countries scoring pretty well on ease of doing business, and particularly the Emiratis and Saudis and Bahrain, of course, have scored pretty well on that, which is a prerequisite for FDIs. In conclusion, I think the same challenge that we had 50 years ago remains, and that is how to turn a depletable liquid asset into a sustainable, productive asset, whether it is in the form of productive units or a productive population. Enhancing the productivity of the population is, we don't need to refer to by now significant example of Singapore and other that are resource poor countries, but they have a very highly productive population. And unfortunately, this challenge today remains, but against a very short horizon of a buffer. Should we fail, I think the precautions are very serious. Thank you very much, and I tried to not exceed my time limit.
Well, thank you so much. This is excellent update on major aspects of required reforms, and perhaps would agree all that the challenges are not new, but what's different is this kind of fast-changing world that we are living in today. So some of the arguments and the discussions could be half a century old, as you mentioned, but now the prospects of the oil sector is different. The expectations from the people of the region at large are different, and the opportunities are much better as well to be exploited, especially with the huge investments that the states of the GCC managed to do well in, which is basically the investment in human capital. Yeah, we'll may come back again to some of the points that you raised through the discussion. And let me now turn it to Dr. Shanfari for his reactions and his comments from Oman's perspective, and perhaps from the sub-regional perspective as well.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
A pleasure to be with you here. I'm very thankful to Dr. Fatma, to all the ERF team who has been doing a great job to bring us all together. This has been a very fruitful day for me. It is excellent dose of knowledge and information that has been updated. So just to start from where Khalid Abdullah left regarding how to enhance revenues. Oman has presented a medium-term fiscal plan between 2020 and 2024. And for the first time among the GCC countries, it has committed to personal tax that is planned to be implemented in 2023. This is going to be very challenging, given that VAT has not yet been implemented and the excess tax that has been committed in Oman. Obviously, these are the easy side of implementing these type of taxes, but an income tax is definitely very challenging. And Oman has already set a goal in terms of 2023 to implement it. I hope they will be able to do it. And as you have been all seeing, especially through the presentation of Daniel Kanda, how Oman is going through a very difficult, both the fiscal side as well as current account challenges, and definitely more to be done in Oman and Bahrain compared to other countries in the GCC. But lately, since 2020, after His Majesty Sultan Haytham took over, there's a lot of bold move in terms of reforming the fiscal balance and to address these fundamental issues. One of the issues that is coming up soon in Oman that has already been implemented is to reduce further the public subsidies for electricity and water. That's quite significant after reforming the petrol prices. And this has added a lot in terms of the leakages in the public finance. More money need to be diverted towards health and education. My interest here is to focus more on the SMEs, especially the development and financing, which has been touched upon by Kanda, Mr. Kanda, and Amira Al-Haddad. So with that, I would like to just again point out the importance of the graph that has been presented in the IMF paper in terms of the contribution of SMEs to the GDP. We saw in Saudi Arabia is the maximum among the GCC countries, and Oman is the lowest, but that's still quite significant how the SMEs has been contributing. These are some of the beautiful graphs that has been illustrated every now and then by the IMF, where we suffer from lack of data available to us in the public. But the IMF had done a great job to show this link between how much financing that the SME is getting from the banks and how much contribution to the GDP. So that's quite illustrative. One thing that I would like to emphasize here, and this is something that Nader Qabbani has touched upon, is the role of technology, the fintech. We know that Saudi Arabia and UAE, as well as Bahrain, have made quite an important progress in trying to create an ecosystem for the fintech sector. And Oman is lagging behind, as well as, in some sense, Kuwait and Bahrain. We have a lot to learn from our neighbors, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia. This is a great opportunity to open up easy access of SMEs to the financing aspect that has been very difficult, not only among the traditional financial institutions, but even development financial institutions. Unfortunately, both these institutions tend to work on a similar approach, how they deal with their credit to SMEs. And this has not been helping a lot in the past. I'm sure there's a lot of potential going forward. And if I can just share with you some of the elements of what we need to have in place for an ecosystem for the fintech. And here we can see that the ecosystem composed of fintech startups themselves, whether they are in the payment systems or in the wealth management or crowdfunding or insurance, all type of aspect of the financial services that can be digitized. And this is a box that was presented in the IMF report. And government has a very important role as part of this ecosystem. Government is the custodian of the regulations and legislations, whether it's the central banks or the capital market authorities. They have a lot of important role to play, and it's a very important element of the ecosystem that need to be in place. Traditional financial institutions, whether they are banks, insurance, stockbrokers, or even capital ventures. So we need to make sure that these traditional financial institutions are able to help the startups in the fintech side, and currently they are not. And one of the issues that has been highlighted in the IMF report is the open source information that's not yet been institutionalized in the Gulf. It has been quite well advanced in Europe and in America. We can benefit a lot, and SMEs can benefit a lot from that. The financial customers, whether they are individuals or organizations, can benefit a lot and can contribute to the fintech ecosystem. And finally, the technology developers, whether they are big data analytic, cloud computing, and now we can see a lot of these services are provided by giant companies like Microsoft and Google, in which the SMEs can benefit tremendously by linking up to the infrastructure that these giant companies are able to provide at a very, very reasonable cost. Some of these services that are provided, for example, in Oman, is extremely expensive for SMEs. But if they are able to tap these international platforms, they can benefit much more. So technology has a lot to play in order to make the SMEs' life easier. And now they are, as we can see from different presentations of today, they have been really almost at the edge of bankruptcy, if not insolvency. That's mainly to do with the government payment that has been focusing, especially in Oman, in paying the salaries as a top priority, and paying the contractors is less of a priority, and that has impacted the SMEs' survival, and this has definitely going to be a long-lasting effect. One way to deal with that, one way to create opportunities for SMEs is to develop a fintech ecosystem that can help and enhance the process of getting loans, as well as that transparency. Technology is a great enabler if we can focus on in terms of policies and gearing up for it instead of just giving it a lip service. As I said, there's a lot to learn from the experiment or from the experience in UAE and in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain for that extent. And I hope this can be a focal point going forward in the medium to long term for GCC policymakers. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Hatem Al-Shanfari, for your intervention. You brought to the discussion a big emphasis on, again, the role of the small and medium enterprises. You highlighted adequately the issues related to fintech and digitalization. And if the emphasis of the policy measures suggested by Dr. Kanda in his presentation is like everywhere else, this kind of work on smart and green recovery, it's major, basically, and when you translate that into policies, it's major restructuring effort with adequate finance and the infrastructure development side as well to build this kind of a new economy. So the three elements here are basically how to get smart economy, greener economy. This is the second element. And then the third is better diversified economy. Using the issues related to digitalization that you mentioned with the support of the fintech, and again, using the good base of human capital and the capacity for transformation, that could really bring the required results, but needs lots of policy coordination and institutional reforms behind that. There is just this issue that keep coming to me after I saw that slide that on the FDI and the SMEs mentioned by Dr. Kanda about the better performance in the early years of the century between 2002 until the global financial crisis. Something positive was happening in attracting the FDI and improving the SMEs. After the global financial crisis, we saw something completely different. This gets me into that aspect. Was it really a policy or a benign global environment that helped that kind of more of a transactional approach rather than a policy-oriented approach? Because other countries, when they had this kind of the shock of the global financial crisis, they resumed their continued attraction of FDI and push for SMEs. That could be a point for analysis and discussion. But now, let me hear from Dr. Raed Safadi with your very broad experience in involved in different policy designs and frameworks. Now you saw the list of suggestions and recommendations, including those coming from the IMF today, on how the GCC governments need to move forward in all of these reforms. So do you see that GCC embedding these measures and reforms in their own agenda? To what extent that all is being internalized, factored in the policies? Dr. Safadi.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I cannot let this opportunity go by without congratulating you on your election to the board. Thank you. And welcoming you as another partner now in another role. I wish you the best of luck, and hopefully we'll get to meet rather than just virtually. Sure. Now, I welcome the report by the IMF, which actually is a major represents a major change since their 2010-11 policy advice, whereby then they were more concerned about fiscal consolidation and sustainability than they are now. So rather than advocate for retrenchment and keeping public finances under control, now they're moving into trying to balance that fiscal consolidation with growth. And, you know, the post-COVID-19 economic recovery marks the onset of a broader challenge, and not just the end of the pandemic that it has created. And rightly, the IMF points that the challenge is to try to strike a balance between supporting economic growth and achieving fiscal sustainability, especially for the GCC country, especially under softening growth prospects for advanced economy and their implications for price of oils, of course. And the fiscal consolidation is already underway in the region through a mix of revenue increases, expenditure reductions, and also spending efficiencies. These measures, you know, they differ, of course, across countries, but they have been taken on board and presented by the IMF right now. So I will not focus my attention on these and instead go for the structural measures that have been taken in the region and also, moving forward. So government in the regions are preparing for themselves for the new experiences coming after this pandemic. The new experiences with continuing their diversification efforts and transition to a non-oil-based economy. And importantly, of course, government policy innovation. And I'd like to underline the importance of this aspect related to the government policy innovations. So I take comfort in the forecasts presented by the IMF, especially the updated one, pointing to a return to economic growth across the region. Indeed, there can be no diversification in the region or anywhere without economic growth. That means productivity has to grow. And I take also comfort from the previous speakers who have underlined the importance of focusing on productivity, not just for fiscal consolidation and stuff or growth, but for the green growth, for the transition to a knowledge-based economy, and of course, to effect that diversification that has been going on for some time. So this time is really different. It is really different, not just because of what's happening with the pandemic and of course the price of oil, but through the focused approach on what needs to be done on the climate change front, on the growth front, on the green growth sustainability issues across the whole spectrum. So currently efforts are underway in the GCC to boost productivity growth by promoting competition, cutting red tape that impedes both business formation and business dissolution, and to a varying degree across the region, liberalizing labor markets. And this is a critical point too. So another critical path towards boosting productivity, a path that most GCC governments have taken, is to push the frontier of innovation and technology. And this requires supportive regulations. And this is where governments are called upon to actually innovate in the policy domain, right? So the GCC partners are actually forging ahead with their integration efforts now. I take you to what you, Dr. Mohieldin, has just alluded to, the Al-Ula Declaration that was signed back by GCC leaders at the conclusion of the 41st, I think, GCC summit in January of this year, that called, among others, for the completion of the requirements for the customs union and the common Gulf market, in addition to achieving full economic integration and ensuring the right for all GCC citizens to work, move, and invest across the GCC states. Importantly, the Al-Ula Declaration encourages joint projects that localize investment in the Gulf. So this is a sea change. Historically, it was a public-private partnerships that actually promoted the infant industry, whatever you call those industries, right? Now, with these moves, we're talking about the private sector taking the lead, across borders within the GCC context and beyond to promote joint investments. These policy decisions that have been taken during the Al-Ula summit will boost competitiveness in the GCC, in tradable goods, and also importantly in the non-tradable sectors, such as in construction, infrastructure, retail, and real estate. At the country level, every GCC member has already embarked on an ambitious program to attract and retain foreign direct investment from GCC nationals and of course from beyond. And let me here, tell you about the experience of Dubai. So early in February this year, Dubai launched Invest in Dubai, a digital platform where investors will find in one place all the information, requirements, and procedures related to starting a Dubai-based business. This move actually complements the changes to the UAE 2015 commercial company law those changes that were introduced back in November 2020, I think, that opened many sectors to foreign investment without the need for a UAE national as a partner or a sponsor. Last October also, 2020, Dubai launched the NASDAQ Dubai Growth Market to assist emerging companies, SMEs, in attracting investors and financing their projects through an initial public offering here in Dubai. The move will not only support local businesses, but also companies, small, medium enterprise companies from different parts of the world, enabling them to expand in the region and internationally. In October last year, Dubai also launched a virtual work program. This is in policy innovation, offering that this virtual work program offers overseas professionals the opportunity to work remotely using Dubai as a residential base, so that they can benefit from Dubai's safe and high quality working and living environment. The program also complements the Golden Visa for long-term residency permits launched in 2019 that allows foreigners to live, work, and study in the UAE without the need for an Emirati sponsor. These and other initiatives currently being considered, including in the context of Al-Ula Declaration, as I stated earlier, provide the perfect environment for attracting and retaining foreign direct investment and critically for boosting productivity. I don't want to abuse of your time, and let me conclude by noting that there are no miracles. Success comes from action taken by governments, businesses, and workers, but also, importantly, by the international organizations, including, in particular, the IMF. All these actors need to pull in the same direction toward greater openness and higher productivity. And in that context, I'll be happy to converse with the IMF mission, who will visit us virtually again at the end of this month for the Article 4 consultations, to try and pinpoint the actual policy innovations that are needed in this era when we're trying to balance conflicting objectives, including the fiscal consolidation and the recovery from the COVID. Thank you so very much, Dr. Mahmoud. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raad Safadi, for this excellent intervention, and many thanks for your offer as well to receive the IMF mission. Definitely, they will benefit from your knowledge and wisdom. I'll take it from where you ended when you emphasized the importance of partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, stakeholders, and of course with the international partners as well. And that could be a nice segue to the intervention of Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan al-Sheikh. When I know that he will be with us with all of this discussion that you started as well, Dr. Safadi, about the work of the UAE in the reforms, not just in business, but embracing science and having that ambitious plan for Mars. And we all followed with admiration the effort, the process, and the great achievement. And I liked it actually when the achievement was attributed not just to the UAE, but it's a kind of an Arab achievement in a region that had been for a while looking forward for such developments in areas of science and technology. Bring it more to Earth, not that far to Mars, but basically this kind of partnership. Some of you may have seen the work on the moonshots, and how can a country with a dedicated program with public investment, with partnership with the private sector, with the science and research centers can do something. Now, of what's called now the mission economy, and there is a new book by Mariana Mazzucato just about this issue, how to get the public investment leading the work on reform, development, and progress. So let's hear then from Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan al-Sheikh about what could be the lessons of that Mars mission on the UAE economy, and that can take us a bit more beyond the short-term, mid-term focus so far on dealing with COVID.
Dr. Mahmoud, thank you very much. Dr. Fatma, Dr. Ibrahim, thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope that I can add value here in a short time. The Mars vision is started with a dream. And if you saw that the early days when this dream was there, I would say almost 98% of the people in the Arab world, they said this is impossible, you are not going to do it. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid announced it in 2014, and he said 2020 we are going to be there, and we were there. We were spot on time, just a few weeks behind the timing allocated. Now, what did that affected the Arab world, and how did it affect the UAE in general and the local economy? I believe the impact, the psychological impact on the Arab world was tremendous, and there was a lot of hypes, a lot of gearing up for from individuals in different countries to reach to the old knowledge of the Arabs and being there as a nation of tradition, as a nation of knowledge, as a nation of competition, rather than just UAE. In UAE, it has frankly raised the bar. It has put the hype that which was there into a real scenario, and an effect that someone would not just talk, is delivering the talk. And I think this is the Sheikh Mohammed, I think it's Sheikh Mohammed words that we don't talk, we show the result than talk. So that has been an effect on the local society here. I think this will push, as I said, the bars up, and we are going to see much more sort of coming up of new projects and having new ideas coming up. In terms of the effect on the economy, I believe the effect is going to be in many ways. I think this will attract a new generation into looking into a venture of that kind of mindset. And UAE and Dubai will have their, it will welcome them. It will provide them with whatever ideas and support, and will nurture their kind of thought. This also will add, I believe so, to a more research-oriented centers around UAE, and in collaboration with different Mars interest countries and centers, which will again will act as a magnet to intellectual minds. Also, that's on the soft part of it. On the hard part of it, industries will take place, and I believe we are going to see a bit of more of sort of going into industries such as rockets and such, not the whole, but participating in much more complex rockets, and that might lead to a mission that will one day we have a mankind on it. And of course, that needs kind of a lot of preparation on that one. I believe this is a crucial point where we have been reading, but there is no action has been taken as a man-made or not made, a man shuttle to the Mars. I believe we are definitely going to see this one, not from UAE, but definitely with collaboration with UAE to have something like this in a short time, maybe 2-3 years time, if not in that range. This also will add to another part. The research centers, I believe, in the local here in UAE, will have lots of outflow of these kind of research centers, and lots of ideas will flow, and it will be commercialized and used into the commercial. You always see that any research centers is not just for the outcome of that kind of research. It's always you find ideas and process and breakthrough when you do research. So I believe that what's going to be there. I think in general that's how I can summarize the effect of Mars in UAE and the Arab world. Thank you.
Yeah, this gives one hope. Thank you so much. And again, as you said it rightly, and you leave it to the good dynamics of research, collaboration between government, the business sector, the partnerships with scientists, and we saw lots of great outcomes in the context of the moonshot. Now we have a Mars shot, which is a longer term, and again, this gets you in opening different channels, and perhaps the rest of the Arab economies with you and through you to the rest of those centers of excellence on technology, and that could really help us getting more serious action towards embracing science and evidence-based approaches, not just in the Mars-related mission, but in conducting economic policies, achieving sustainable development as well. It's a way of life rather than a segmented approach to a particular important aspect like reaching Mars. Thank you so much. And now, Dr. Majid Al-Munayf, the floor is yours. You have been patient listening to all of the comments and the discussions and the presentation. Perhaps you can highlight with your experience the different ways that the GCC economies at large differ from the rest of the economies in the region, and what are the fiscal and labor market policies, in particular in Saudi Arabia, are going to be developed in the future, not just to accommodate the shocks that we talked about, but definitely for a post-COVID world. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mohieldin. And I don't know, is everybody still there?
Yes, everybody
left.
No, all of there.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Fatma and Dr. Ibrahim and the ERF staff, Shireen, and all others for organizing this event, which so far looks very rich. The two morning sessions and this session. I don't know, after I heard all the previous speakers, I don't know what can I add more, but I'll probably start with your opening remark about peak oil demand. The second quarter of 2020 gave us a dry run of what it might mean if and when the world reaches peak oil demand, we had demand declining by something like 30%. Oil demand, prices declining by more than 60% or so. So we had that experience, that what it means if and when war reaches. Of course, the jury is still out as to the speed and when the peak oil demand and but the direction is there. There is a direction for a decarbonized world. And I think our countries has to be part of this transition, not only on the sideline and just watching what will transpire. So if it's a green economy, we should be part of that green economy. We should invest more into the green economy. Some of our countries are even investing in renewables and in making oil greener, investing in hydrogen, blue hydrogen, in carbon capture and the storage, and so on. So we have to be part of that transition rather than sit back and wait when and how the peak oil demand will happen. We saw it. We saw a 30% decline in world oil demand. So we have to be ready, but ready for a new world, and we have to be part of it and invest heavily in the green, in our green economy, and circular carbon economy, recycling, reuse. As a matter of fact, we have to invest heavily in R&D in trying to find other ways of non-burning uses of our oil and gas. Non-burning, that is like, not like in transportation, go into chemicals and directly from oil to chemicals, technologies, and so on. So this is one of the main challenges. Your major resource has to be part of the world transition rather than an obstacle to this. There are some other issues that were raised here about FDI, and I'd like to make it at least clear. There is a high correlation or association between FDI to our countries and oil prices, and of course, growth. Most of the FDIs the past 20 or so years have come either to oil and its derivatives, petrochemicals, and so on, and to services sector and real estate. Now, is that the FDI that we would like it to continue? Is this? I think there has to be some structural adjustment to our economies. If we are to attract FDIs, then there should be other sectors. You know, we will be host to some green economic sectors. Why not? In circular carbon, and non-burning uses of oil, and renewables. We've got good experiences in the UAE and Saudi Arabia in renewables, and we should continue on this. So this depends on how fast we go and how we approach this, our diversification of our economic diversification, to make FDI or our countries more conducive to FDI in other sectors, not only the old finance, real estate, and oil derivatives, you know, including chemicals. Also, on the question of SMEs, the SMEs in the region, at least I know in Saudi Arabia, are highly expatriate labor intensive and low tech. They are concentrating, the SMEs are concentrating mainly in trade, hospitality, restaurants, and so on. And those, they cannot continue to be like this. The SMEs, and through I appreciated the data of the IMF on the SMEs contribution in Saudi Arabia, like 34%. But their share of local labor is less than 10%. So they are employing expatriate labor force, employing technologies that are still simple technologies and so on. So there has to be structural changes in the SME also, and there is a role for the government here to try to guide the SMEs and to support venture capital into new areas. It tried to adjust and help the SMEs to be more productive and employ more local workforce. The SMEs in Saudi Arabia, and I think elsewhere, they are not like, family oriented. They're basically expatriate intensive and into sectors that are not very productive, that the value added of the sectors that they are. And so we have to look carefully as how to support the SMEs, but also to adjust their business models. The other issue that was raised was taxes. I think it's good that it has been raised, and it's about time for the GCC to reconsider this, because they will also, by looking at taxes, they will reconsider the so-called the implicit social contract. On that, the taxes, you cannot impose income tax if all the wage earners work for the government, because at the end of the day, you're taxing your own workforce. So probably income tax might be premature now, but corporate and even corporate tax at the time of downside, at the time when we'd like to private sector to take over, might not be there. But I like the idea that the IMF had mentioned, wealth tax or property taxes in the GCC. Those might be easy to implement, and they would, from a social perspective, they would more equitable than, say, income taxes or say increasing the VAT like what we did. Just to consider wealth or property taxes that, or start with the property taxes. But all those taxes should be combined also with addressing the expenditure side, the fiscal, especially current expenditure, whereby wages constitute something like 40 to 30% or 60% of the expenditure. And there is lots of areas of rationalization in that current expenditure. By rationalizing it, you might close the gap, the wage gap between expatriate workforce and local workforce, because now still the public sector is the sector of last resort, is the preferable sector. Is that because that's a huge wage gap, and there has to be a reforms to that public sector, the hiring, the productivity, the promotion, and so on. Also, there's areas to rationalize the capital expenditure. Capital expenditure in the GCC is really not as productive as elsewhere. There are lots of loopholes there, and in the tendering of those government projects that has to be addressed. We in Saudi Arabia set up a special commission to rationalize expenditure in its current and capital form, including government purchases and so on. So on the fiscal side, tax is fine, we have to address that, but we also have to address rationalizing expenditure, including addressing the subsidies, especially energy subsidies. We cannot continue like this. Energy subsidy has been highly regressive, benefiting the few, and we have to address the energy subsidies to make sure that if it is directed to the beneficiaries or to those in need. Also, along with this, addressing fiscal consolidation subsidies, also we have to address corruption. It's a tough issue, it's a political economic issue, but our countries, some of our countries, including Saudi Arabia, we've addressed it. We're setting up, or we have set up a corruption commission that has been active in following up on those. So those issues are of great importance. The other issue that I'd like to address is labor market reform. Addressing the public-private sector dichotomy or employment or expatriate local workforce. And also we found out that addressing male and female labor market is of great importance to us. In the past 5 years, when we eased the restrictions on commingling of sexes in the workplace and empowering women with social and cultural reforms, female labor participation rate doubled just in 5 years, from 15% to something like 32%. We were even targeting this 30% by 2030. We accomplished this this year. And with this, we found out that it even contributes to easing the dependence on foreign labor. This is a great labor force that has to be tapped and given. So addressing labor market reforms, trying to close the wage gap, trying also to look at the work conditions of the foreign workforce, their mobility, horizontal and vertical mobility is important, and also look at the gender gap. We found out this is very important. I don't have much to add except FDI taxes. I've touched on this. The pandemic also have brought in other, at least the positive part, except for the one that I mentioned in the second quarter that says that that's what it means to be there. That investment in human capital and health services is very important. The GCC, most of the GCC countries have been very aggressive in investing in human resources and in health services. And this paid off. our investment paid off when we had to address the challenge of COVID. We had good health facilities, good health systems in place, and well-trained doctors and medical staff that took us through the pandemic. And that's why we find at least the GCC, compared to other countries, they fared better. I think the reason why we fared better is because we had that high investment in human capital and in health service, and the investment in digital economy. We organized the G20 and we had to organize more than hundreds of virtual meetings like this. What helped us organize such thing is that our investment also in digital economy, and I think most of the GCC countries has been good at that compared to other countries. Now, probably I conclude with the why GCC is different than other MENA countries. Of course, oil and expatriate workforce, this has been mentioned twice. Our dependence on oil and our expatriate workforce had made at least the choices that we face different than the choices that other countries face. I think the relative stability, political stability that the GCC has had compared to other countries. In the past 5 years, we saw in most, I think probably 4 of the GCC countries, a transition of power, smooth transition of power that you don't see it as smooth as it is elsewhere. We've got changes of leadership in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Oman, in Kuwait. So this relative stability, and also probably what helped us is that prior to the COVID, we had the big drop in prices in 2015, and we had to face the choice whether this drop in prices is just transitory and it will soon go back to normal, or it is a structural change. It turned out to be structural. So we adopted the approach that this is a structural change and we have to live with the new normal. This is the new normal that that has resulted after 2015. So this is all what I have as a differences, and sorry if I took more than my time. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. This is excellent. You didn't just add to our knowledge and understanding of what's happening in the GCC and Saudi Arabia, but you almost touch upon every point raised in the session, one by one, in a very articulate way. For that, I'm very grateful to you, because you made my life easier here in concluding this session, unless there are some comments or questions coming through Dr. Ibrahim or Dr. Fatma. I'd like to hear them, but if I can just react to what you just mentioned, Dr. Majid, is yes, the great realization of the kind of change in the oil market. If it is not really short term, it is not cyclical, it's beyond that. It is the as you said, it's the new normal. It's part of the mega trends. But again, with the shifts that we see, given that the rich history of the GCC countries in dealing with energy, there is always going to be an energy demand. Now, that may not really be peaking as far as the humanity is progressing and developing and producing. It's the sources of energy that are going to be shifted. And we see in the different policies, especially on the 2030 visions from the different countries, that many of the countries that are today centers of oil and natural gas are shifting towards being centers of energy, but in a smarter way, in a better and diversified way, and definitely in a greener modalities and approach than what's being handled before. On the FDI, you are absolutely right. Perhaps the GCC countries still have the luxury in picking and choosing from FDI to have this kind of emphasis on productivity and value added, because FDI in the case of GCC may not just be a source of capital, but definitely a source of knowledge and know-how. Like your points on the SMEs, and again the issue related to the value-added aspects of the SMEs, and in what way the public policies need to incentivize this kind of a change, because businesses respond to whatever they see of incentive structure in the market that they work in. Give us a couple of suggestions on how tax policies could really have an emphasis. I like your links with, it's not just about fiscal imbalances to be fixed, but linking that to social aspects and equity. And indeed, it's all at the end about the different aspects of investment in human capital, investment in infrastructure and digitalization, and investments in resilience of the economies and the society at large. So I think with the 5 panelists and our presenter today, I had a great tour of the state of the economic affairs and the political economy dynamics and the changes as well in the world, and how they are impacting and having an effect on GCC countries and the rest of the region, and what could be the best policy measures designed for a future consideration. Dr. Khaled, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I'd just like to reflect on one of the points that raised, and which has to do with the technology.
Yeah, right.
The technology is presented as with absolute positivity, whereby I think we have to also think about the negative aspect of it. In Bahrain, for example, banking has been the main source of expanding the middle class through the employment of youngsters in this sector, which is enjoying a decent pay. If we aggressively go on fintech, then we are really cutting the number required for employment. So it is not absolutely positive at the time where you have thousands of new graduates seeking jobs. To illustrate this, maybe I will share a very extreme example, assuming which is a dilemma for humanity, actually, not the GCC. And in this example, whereby people discussing, assuming that we went robotic all the way, and we made people redundant. These robotics are magnificent in terms of productivity. They can turn numbers like anything. But people are not working and they don't have income to demand whatever these robots are producing. And some countries started to introduce the concept of sovereign income, whereby they say you don't work, but we will give you income. I think lately it was voted out in Switzerland. People refuse to take that, but this is one of the things. So we don't want to solve something and on the other hand create another problem. Please don't, maybe I sound a bit anti-modernization or conservative. I do approach technology with the efficiency it introduces, but I don't. What I'm calling for really is don't try to do it for a showbiz. whereby you want to show that you are modern and you are like advanced economies. You need to think about this more subtly and measure the impact on your social fabrics. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohieldin, for allowing me to talk.
All right, thank you so much. This is a very good reminder of the pros and cons of technology. And I think before we're struck by the COVID-19 crisis, the whole debate of the fourth industrial revolution and its impact on the labor market, and the recent work by the ILO on the future of jobs is addressing this issue, that definitely there are going to be, at least in the transition, short-term, mid-term, some major job losses, but net is going to be with a positive impact on the labor market. How can you maximize the benefit, minimize the damage that could cause, as you mentioned? How can you design new policies? And instantly, there was a discussion that we had in a different context in the political economy of Egypt, that while one of the major challenges facing us at labor market and employment for the youth, you don't really have this kind of priority given for the policy for employment. Employment and jobs are being seen in the old traditional way as derived from the overall progress and growth. I think it's about time really to consider issues related to having employment policy. There are great examples in Asia on how to do that. Definitely we need to design social safety nets and social protection measures, including the reconsideration of something like universal basic income that could really be of help. But that is all on the compensation side. But there is a great potential if we are on the right side of technology by being part of the dividend, not really just suffering from the divide. It's a point well taken for the policymaking purposes. I wonder if there are any further. Dr. Ibrahim, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I was intending also to raise the issue of the universal basic income from the perspective of liberating governments in the GCC from having to subsidize in an inefficient way businesses and companies that are owned by nationals along the lines, for example, that was discussed by Dr. Amir Al-Haddad in the context of Kuwait. So to the extent that a universal basic income would actually could be construed as a substitution for this kind of subsidies and the high wages in the government sector, I was wondering whether this might be an issue of interest for the consideration, because actually now everybody is talking about UBI. Yesterday, I read an article about a township in California that experimented for 2 years with a $500 unconditional transfer to every citizen living, citizen or non-citizen living in that town. And the results were startling in terms of how this just marginal effect had improved lives in that township in California. And then, of course, in low-income countries, in emerging market economies, everybody is talking about the post-COVID-19, that there are 3 aspects of policy that needs to be considered, obviously, universal health and digitization and digital platforms. And then the third one is UBI.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Ibrahim, this could be an interesting topic as well that you can lead for the GCC and for other countries in the region. Our friends and researchers from the ILO have been working hard on actually what could be considered as a kind of competing paradigms. While the merits and good implications of UBI could be realized, but there is as well some other schools talking about universal social protection. So the idea, UBI at the end is one of the ways that you need to consider. We can see the efficiency, if you are, especially with digitalization, better targeting, even if you are not going to do that conditionally, but basically to make sure that everybody is covered through the system. If you have a good system of financial inclusion with the digitalization of the financial system, that could be easy to handle with lower transaction costs. But again, there are some other aspects that you need really to consider as well. So perhaps a discussion with our researchers, there are many at the ILO, and definitely the World Bank and other institutions. We take that issue as well seriously from the fiscal implications, and there are colleagues that Dr. Kanda as well can help us in getting, if you want to do that as well within the fiscal policy framework. So let me see if there are further comments or points that anyone from the panelists or the participants want to raise. If not, I know that we started late, but we're 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Yes.
There are 8 questions in the Q&A section that you may wish to check.
Okay, because I was focusing on the...
yeah, and Dr. Mahmoud Haddad has his hand raised. I think he'd like to have the floor.
Okay, so so let's see who's raising his hand. Please take the floor.
Question, I think, addressed to me.
Yeah, please. So let's see the hand.
There had been, FDI historically had been in oil and gas sectors or services, and what are, in as much as we try to diversify into new sectors, some of them might be closer to oil, but more technology intensive, more knowledge intensive sectors, the better. So I'm not ruling out FDI in the oil and gas sector or in the finance sector. They're still very attractive in the GCC, and even real estate is still attractive. But we also have to create other sectors that would be as attractive to FDI. And this depends on our diversification drive, whether in telecommunications, technology, solar, wind technologies, and so on. So this is not to rule out oil and gas investments as because they are still attractive and finance, but to find other sectors, and this depends on how we will be in diversifying our economies.
The novel concept of peer-to-peer electronic cash systems, and really being the source of all.
Okay, thanks. Can see some noise in the background.
Yeah, not my part.
Thank you so much, Dr. Majid, for this comment. We saw some comments on the question and answer section here on the perspectives of the GCC and the emphasis on total factor productivity. I think we tackled that in different ways during the discussion, talking about policy incentives and regulatory reforms. So that was handled as well. Dr. Shireen was saying that someone was raising her or his hand. I don't see that in my
Dr. Mahmoud Haddad is raising his hand, and he's got the floor if he'd like to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Mahmoud Haddad, please take the floor.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum وألف شكر لكم. تحياتنا للجميع الإخوة بدون ذكر أسماء، كلكم إخوة وكلكم يعني colleagues for us brothers. في عندي سؤال للدكتور خالد وللجميع طبعا، لأنه نحكي عن الجولف country most likely. إنه what is the impact of labor nationalization on labor cost, and if that's going to reduce the labor cost or increase labor cost, how is that going to affect the velocity of money turnover? Because money will be kept because we reduce remittances. That's one. Second, I think that in order, some of you have mentioned that we need to spend more on non-consumer or invest more in non-consumer and in productive asset. I think that's the one point, but the previous one is a question about the impact of labor cost on labor nationalization and velocity of money. I am not an economist, by the way, but I would like to learn from you guys. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haddad, for your question. Dr. Khalid, it was directed to you, and of course, any of the panelists if would like to.
I think whenever we talk about nationalization, as Dr. Mohammed Haddad referred to it, the issue of cost always comes up. And obviously, this is an issue, especially to private sector. But as I mentioned earlier, this issue is the case because of the dumping effect. And at the same time, we are protecting our marble industry, our brick industry, our whatever industry through anti-dumping policies, but we are not protecting our human capital. And there is a cost. When you have anti-dumping policies, you are paying more for the national locally produced brick or locally produced cupboard or whatever. So yes, but there is an increase in the cost, but you are looking at the national interest in approaching this. Having said that, this doesn't mean that there should not be serious effort, and this effort should tackle both the technical efficiency side and the work ethic and cultural side. So, and introduce technology. And today in the construction sector, if you go to any advanced country, they are using so much advanced technologies whereby the number of labor involved are very limited, and whoever is working is getting a hefty income. I think because of the dumping effect, it distorted the resources pricing, capital versus labor. But if we introduce these technologies, labor productivity would increase, and income that they can get increased, which would attract nationals to work in this sector as a professionals rather than unskilled labor. It is not an easy it is not an easy issue to tackle in a linear approach. It has a multifaceted aspect to it, and it is challenging. But at least from the policy side, and today we are having people at the decision making are basing some decision with regard to expat because he has a building to rent.
Yeah.
So we need to address it from a national interest policy. I didn't get the velocity. I'm not sure, frankly. Of course, when you decrease your remit, you have more income internally. The stock, the leakage is reduced. So the money stock is kept inside the country.
Right.
Thank you. I answered as much as I can.
Okay, no, thank you so much. You did great. I see the hand of Dr. Raed Safadi, and this could be the last intervention for today. Unless Dr. Majid, do you like to say something as well? Okay, so after Dr. Raed Safadi, we'll hear from Dr. Majid, and then we will conclude unless any of the other panelists want to take the floor. I see no other.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I want to take issue with the terminology that Dr. Khalid is using, the dumping of labor, right? It is not just the definitional issue, right? It's the conceptual issue. Dumping means what you're saying below cost of production, right? So this is how you introduce anti-dumping duties on any imports, even if you talk about the human beings, right? Now, the wages that anyone receives, be they expat, be they whatever nationality, reflect what? Their levels of productivity, right? So if their level of productivity is X, they cannot be receiving X minus, right? And if you were to compare the level of productivity of nationality A with nationality B, right? Then of course, this is where demand for nationality A versus demands for nationality B takes place. right? So this is not I mean, you repeated it at least 10 times, you know, dumping and anti-dumping and all this. So conceptually, it's not the right approach to talk about it, except that when you look at the reforms in labor markets, right? The main objective is to increase the local participation of locals in the labor market. It is not equated to reducing the labor participation of expats. It can be a positive sum game. The minute you start talking about it as a zero-sum game, then we get into this type of a disagreement, and then the wrong labor market reforms will be adopted. It is a positive sum game, right? Think about it this way, that increasing the labor market participation of expat does not equate with reducing foreign labor participation in local labor market. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Point well taken and articulately raised. Dr. Mesh.
My turn, more or less along the same. I'd like to look at it this way. It is trying to close the wage gap. That's all what it wage gap between expatriates and local force. Not necessarily by, but in the wages in the public sector where most of the national workforce work is really very high. It is eating up most of our oil income. So the wages in the public sector are very high, and the same time the wages of expatriates are a lot lower. So what could be done, and we have done this, and is to try to tax the importation of labor. Many of the private sector they were fine with, but they accepted taxation, and they continue. Some others who could not tolerate the taxation of the labor force will still be coming, but it is the business who will pay for the extra. We're trying to close the wage gap. And to answer the question of Mr. Haddad, Mahmoud Haddad, he said something about the nationalization of this is part of the nationalization. All policies have costs and benefits. And policymakers have to make way the costs and benefits and see how its impact on the economy, on the private sector, on the social sphere, and so on. So all this has to be taken into consideration, and the GCC countries will still be labor importing countries for years to come, and as much as they will continue to be oil dependent for the years to come. But how much dependent on oil and how much you're dependent on expatriate workforce, this is the issue.
Right. Thank you so much.
Sure, just to
Dr. Khaled, yes, and we really need to thank you.
Of course, I have to admit that he's right technically, and maybe the use of يعني أنا even يعني محرج إن أستخدم دي الكلمة from a human right issue, but when I used it referring to the impact of it. يعني leaving the technicality of it aside, the impact of it. يعني when you have a national labor force and you open up your borders for an influx of a huge numbers of skilled and unskilled labor, can anybody, if you try to get a work permit going to UK or France or any other country in Europe or elsewhere, do you think it is easy for us to work, for example, I'm citing an example, in India? Yani I was working in a bank and we had a branch in India, and the difficulty with which we faced, to the extent that we wanted to leave, even when we wanted to leave to dismantle the branch, it was not easy. There was a Standard Chartered Bank wanted to acquire the branch, they didn't allow it because countries apply rules along national interest. Unfortunately, today, as Dr. Majid mentioned, we have national security issue. A number of sectors are not within national. The retail sector, the construction sector today, there is an issue of national interest whereby, with all utmost regard to human rights, and I think as any labor should enjoy the full spectrum of rights and pays and everything. This is a principle, but also from a national interest. When I again using this antonym, a brick that you are protecting, this brick will not need to get married, will not need to eat, doesn't have aspiration as a human to fulfill needs in life, but you are protecting this brick. On the other hand, you have your nationals, your youngsters who have studied and now approaching labor market. You are not adopting policies, or you are not first enabling them. So you need to enable them, and without compromise in terms of productivity. Even I will compromise a little bit until they gain. So while agreeing with you totally, and while apologizing for any use that might be degrading, which is not the intention, the impact is such.
Yeah.
And sorry for taking so much time, and thank you, Dr. Mohieldin, for your tolerance with me.
No, thank you so much. It's all important issues you raised, and I see from a distance my good friend, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, taking notes, perhaps these notes for ideas of future topics for discussion based on this very rich discussion that we had today. I've been attending many meetings and sessions discussing the GCC economies, the structures of the economies, the management, the challenges and the policy implications. Yeah, I think there is a background again. Okay, this is one of the virtual challenges. There is some background noise. But this one was really one of the richest, with ideas for policymakers, good suggestions for research. And this is basically the aims of our ERF, is to really enhance knowledge, debate, and advise the policymakers. So I think we touch upon different aspects that cannot really be summarized at this stage, but I'd like really to thank you all for the excellent participation. And I will give the floor now, after thanking Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Fatima, and Dr. Shireen, and the whole of the ERF team. We'll go back to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. And if you could allow me, just before I exercise my bureaucratic role, being specialized in exchange rate economics, I think the question asked by Dr. Mahmoud is actually quite a profound question, because there is literature, including on the GCC, that suggests that the high transfers by the expatriates have actually imparted, especially in Saudi Arabia, imparted a huge competitiveness to local industries because of the fixed exchange rate regime. Because all of the GCC countries have actually pegged their currency, or in the case of Kuwait, a peg to the basket. So actually the transfer by the expatriate labor actually acts like a capital outflow. And so therefore it actually enhances the competitiveness of the fixed exchange rate. So one dimension might be not very important at this moment, but in the future, when actually the expatriate labor is reduced significantly, then probably the exchange rate regime might be less competitive. So that is one, and there is some literature actually, including some papers sponsored by ERF on this particular area. But let me, without further ado, actually thank you, Dr. Mahmoud and Dr. Daniel Kanda, and the very distinguished panelists. And we are very grateful actually that this panelist actually involves people of different backgrounds. We have businessmen, we have researchers and policymakers, and I think and academics. I think this has been very rich and actually quite uplifting discussion. And I would like to also implore you and request you to continue being with us tomorrow, because we will also have some very interesting sessions tomorrow, including a plenary with Dr. Nader Ghabbani on a very important issue on labor market policies and other policies. And then, 3 sessions, and to be capped by a very interesting conversation with Her Excellency Dr. Rula Datchi, the Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and the former minister from Kuwait, who will also, she will also speak about some of these important issues for the GCC. So thank you so much, but I would like also to give the floor to Shireen, maybe if you want to say, and Dr. Fatma as well.
Just warm thanks to each and everybody. It's been a fantastic and rich day. Excellent, as always, with the promising issues to talk about the GCC, starting from the future outlook to the challenges, to the very analytical perspective that has been discussed. I'm really, really, really grateful. And just by way of also wrapping up today and reflecting on it, tomorrow there's going to be, in closing after the conversation with Dr. Rula Datchi, an announcement made by Dr. Ibrahim of the 2 Best Paper Awards. So in recognition of those very rich papers that were solicited as part of the open call. Again, I really thank each and everybody, and grateful for your participation and rich discussions. And on to Dr. Fatma.
I join my colleagues to thank everybody for this excellent and rich session. Thank you very much for your contribution, and we hope that we'll continue having similar sessions in the future and in our activities, and we look forward your support for the GCC initiatives that will really, we will not move without your support and your contribution. Thank you very much for every one of you, and we hope that we will see you again.